In the last video, we talked about one of the best human beings who ever lived among us, but today's case has nothing good about it. Meet Ed Gein. Edward Theodore Gein. Few names have caused as much fear or been as impactful on American culture as this name. Well, what you're about to see is a glimpse into the universe of real violence. This video is not recommended for the faint of heart or minors. It is not fiction, it is not cinema, it is a real case, terrifying, a case that tested the limits of the police and an entire society. We will now witness a toll, a small piece of the life of Ed Gein, the killer who stole the skin of his victims. What is the best way to portray the trajectory of a monster? To explore his human side, his weaknesses? I don't think so. Ed Gein terrorized a community, violated the memories of dozens of people, took the lives of at least 2 innocent victims. He was born human, but was a monster. Decades after his crimes, his grave still receives visits from fans. How is that possible? No, we won't dare enter Ed Gein's mind. It's like a dark sun that you shouldn't look directly at. You understand? We're going to show here the point of view of the sheriff who captured Ed Gein. The closest we'll get to Ed Gein's mind is the trajectory of his mother, the woman who may have turned a child into an incorrigible psychopath. That will be our path, okay? So that will be the real case of Ed Gein. Everything has a limit. Sheriff Art Schelling found his limit in November of 1957. He was only 32 years old, but he had already seen more horrors than most police officers would see in a lifetime of work. And there, Art Schelling found his limit. He grabbed the suspect's head during the interrogation with all the revulsion in the world. At that moment, Art Schelling ignored his badge, ignored his oath, ignored the laws. He grabbed the suspect's head and slammed it against the wall. He slammed the suspect's face against the brick wall, once, twice, 3 times, until the adrenaline subsided. At that moment, he saw no other humanly possible reaction. The suspect had confessed everything. Art Schelling couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand the confession. He couldn't stand the suspect's antics. He remembered everything he had done before, and he acted. Look, it was very close to the case being closed right there in the interrogation room. The confession, it ended up being annulled due to police brutality. But okay, for us to understand Sheriff Art Schelling's reaction, we're going to have to go back in time, a long way back, decades back, and learn the story of an immigrant descendant named Augusta Wilhelmine. Augusta was born in 1878 as Augusta Wilhelmine Lurk. Despite this name, she was born on the banks of the Mississippi River in the American state of Wisconsin. She was one of 8 sisters, children of German immigrants who had fled religious persecution in former Prussia. She and her family were part of a very old segment of the Lutheran Church, a profoundly radical segment. For this segment, every human thought and every human action is imbued with sins and sinful motives. For that family, and others who believed in the same interpretation of the Bible, all of humanity deserved eternal damnation in hell. Augusta was raised in this environment, but married at age 22 to a carpenter, hunter, and choir professional named George Philip Gein. George was also a descendant of German immigrants. That's precisely why he carried that surname so strange by American standards. That surname was passed on to Augusta, who became known as Augusta Gein. She regretted the marriage almost instantly. George did not follow the same religious principles. More than that, George was an alcoholic, yet Augusta could not divorce her husband for the same principles she followed. What God joined together, she could not separate. Augusta then dedicated herself to her children. First came Henry, then came Edward. Augusta sold a grocery store in the city to buy a small farm away where she could raise her children away from the influence of worldly temptations. It was a mistake. Augusta taught her children that all women were sinners except herself. All the others would be instruments of the devil to corrupt the hearts of men. She explained that evil is part of being human, and the world was a place of immorality. The children attended school, but returned home and received the harshest of educations. Augusta would only teach her children selected parts of the Old Testament about death, murder, and divine punishment. Henry, the eldest son, went through this childhood relatively unscathed. Edward, the sensitive, fragile, and shy younger son, couldn't escape. The two were forbidden from making friends at school. Augusta insisted that all the other students came from families corrupted by sin. Any deviation from the path for Henry and Edward was grounds for punishment. People who studied with Edward remembered the insecure young man, a young man who laughed in corners for no apparent reason. Edward ended up developing an obsession with his mother, his only shelter, his only comfort, his only adult role model. Outsiders were not welcome on the farm. Friends were impossible. His own brother isolated him. His father was an alcoholic. In 1940, George, the father, died at age 66, leaving his wife and children destitute. Edward and Henry had to accept any kind of work in the neighborhood to help support their mother. Augusta continued to indoctrinate Edward, telling her son that he should remain loyal to her forever. The only way for him to maintain this loyalty would be by remaining a virgin. Sex was a sin and would open the gates of hell for him. Henry, the eldest son, tried to follow his own path. He fell in love with a widow who lived nearby. He planned to leave home and live with the woman. Henry also sought to keep his brother Edward away from his mother's clutches. Henry managed to see that his mother's devotion was not healthy, that what his mother taught could not be the will of God. Henry couldn't convince Edward of anything. The connection between Edward and Augusta was something that would remain forever, for good and especially for evil. Unfortunately, Henry didn't realize the danger. Nobody realized the danger. Henry Gein died in a fire in 1944, 4 years after his father's death. The circumstances of this fire were never clarified. At the time, Edward even claimed that he and his brother were doing a controlled burn in the sea within the property and lost control of the situation. The flames spread, the firefighters were called, and it was only when the fire was extinguished that Edward reported that his brother had disappeared. The searches were conducted during the night, and Henry's body was found face down with his face turned to the ground. He had no signs of burns, but Henry had an impact mark on his head. The police ruled out the possibility of murder. In the record, Henry Gein is listed as having died from asphyxiation by smoke inhalation. No autopsy was performed. Nobody realized the danger. Nobody realized that Cain had killed Abel. Well, Augusta had lost her husband and a son, but she still had Edward, her eternal Ed, her devoted son Ed. Well, Augusta suffered a stroke in the same year that Henry passed away. Who was there to take care of her? Ed. Augusta would still leave one last legacy for Ed before the end. In 1945, confined to a wheelchair, the anti-powerful Augusta Gein still had the strength for one last example, for one last legacy of hatred and horror. The case happened when Augusta and Ed went to visit a farmer named Smith who lived nearby. They went to buy straw. Augusta saw Smith beating a dog. A woman came out of Smith's house and ordered him to stop the violence. Smith did not argue and beat the animal to death. Augusta Gein was shocked, not by the violence, not by the cowardice, not by the fate of the animal. Augusta Gein was shocked by the woman. Smith was not married. If there was a woman inside Smith's house, it could only mean that the neighbor was living a sin. Augusta then ordered her son never again to do business with Smith or with the one she called a whore. That same year, Augusta passed away at 67 years old. She left Edward alone in the world, alone with his thoughts, alone with his wickedness. Edward was about to explore Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield. 12 years later, Ed Gein would have his face stuck in a brick wall. November 16, 1957, Saturday, the second day of deer hunting season in the region. Bernice Walling was taking care of the family hardware store, as she had done every day since her husband's death. This had been her routine for the past 15 years. She was loved and respected by everyone in Plainfield. That day, the expected movement was very small, because it was a Saturday and because it was hunting season. Well, very few customers went to the store that day. Nobody saw anything. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Bernice's son, the assistant sheriff, Frank Warden, finished his shift and decided to stop by the store to see how things were going. The store was empty. The front door was unlocked, and there was no one inside. The cash register was still open, and there was a trail of blood leading from the counter to the back door. On the floor, there was a rifle cartridge, the same type of design a deer hunter would use. Frank Warden froze instantly. The signs were too clear. They were signs of a crime. And Frank Warden froze because he had seen all this before. The clues were identical to the clues of another woman's disappearance. 3 years earlier, Mary Hogan was tending to a secluded bar in the countryside and disappeared in the same way. The police had found a rifle casing on the floor and a trail of blood to the door. 3 years later, Mary Hogan was still missing. Well, the small town of Plainfield had fewer than 700 inhabitants. It was a small place. Everyone knew each other. Everyone frequented the same stores to buy what they needed. Everyone helped each other when the task was too big. Everyone had studied at the same school. How could a robbery be possible in that community? Twice, Frank Warden's mind returned to the last few days. He knew that his mother had received a visit from a very special customer the day before. Ed Gein had been in the store and jokingly asked if Bernice wanted to go skating with him. It was a very strange behavior. Everyone knew Ed Gein as a hermit, a weird guy who lived isolated in a house where nobody could enter. Nobody had ever seen Ed Gein with a woman, and suddenly he was flirting with the owner of the hardware store. Ed Gein had also asked if the store would open the next day. Bernice confirmed that the store would be open and that she would be there taking care of everything. Ed Gein promised that he would return to buy good antifreeze. Frank Warden examined the store's tax receipt book. The last entry made by Bernice Warden was precisely for the sale of antifreeze. It was the last receipt. It was her mother's handwriting. Frank asked his police friends to take a look at the Gein farm. At least Ed Gein might have seen something, you understand? Well, the police went there. Nobody answered. They returned. Frank didn't give up. Hours later, he spoke with the county sheriff, Art Shelley. Could the sheriff search the property? Shelley agreed and went to the Gein farm with another assistant. It was already night. Ed Gein was definitely not home. There was no electricity in the house, right? Deep darkness covered the place. Well, Art Shelley pulled out his flashlight. He hadn't gone there for nothing. If Frank asked, it was because things were serious. He kept the image of Bernice in his mind. It was crucial to find Frank's mother's whereabouts, but where to look? Ed Gein's house was an old two-story building. Next to the house was a kind of wooden annex. Next to this annex was what is called a summer kitchen, a space for a wood-burning oven for cooking on hot days. Shelley chose to start right there. He was right on the money. The door was open. Shelley and his assistant turned on their flashlights and were surprised. There was something hanging from hooks in the ceiling. It was the carcass of a recently slaughtered deer, but it wasn't. It was the carcass of a person hanging by their legs. It was the carcass of a decapitated person dressed in the skin of a deer. It was the carcass of Bernice Ward. Art Shelley immediately left the place and vomited everything he could on the farm floor. That was just the beginning of a night that would mark the sheriff until the end of his days.
The sheriff gathered his courage and returned. In that same kitchen, he found Bernice's head in a cloth bag. Her organs had been removed and stored in a bucket in a window. Inside the wood-burning stove, the police found Bernice's heart. She had been shot and treated like an animal. The Madison City forensics team was called in that same night. They would be much better prepared for this type of case. Police from several neighboring counties were called in for both tasks, to locate Ed Gein and revisit the rest of the house. A portable freezer was brought to the location, and several spotlights were installed to illuminate all 9 rooms of Ed Gein's residence. There were piles of trash, bottles, old newspapers, tools, but unfortunately, that wasn't all. What the police found in that house was a terrifying, grotesque, and real scene. The house was deceiving. It looked like a home, but it was a branch of hell. On the kitchen table of the main house was what appeared to be a simple soup plate, but it wasn't. It was the top part of a human skull. 2 skulls were found serving as decoration on Ed Gein's bedside table. Little by little, the police were identifying all the furniture in the house. Ed Gein had inherited from his father the skill of working with carpentry and leather. The police found entire chairs made of bones or upholstered with human skin. And it didn't stop there. Lampshades, a trash can, tables, everything was made entirely of human remains or using human remains as decoration. Arms, legs, heads, nipples, vaginas, noses, lips, nails. Nothing was spared by Ed Gein. The commotion attracted the press. The police formed a cordon around the house. At that scene, the journalists already knew that the body of Bernice Wadham had been found, but they didn't understand why so many police officers were there. They didn't understand why the expressions on their faces were so frightened. Well, it was Art Sheriff who delivered the only statement that was possible to make that night. The sheriff said, "It's simply too horrible. It's horrible beyond possibility." The number of victims couldn't be calculated. All women. The night seemed endless. In a box inside one of the rooms, the police found the skull of Mary Hogan, who had disappeared 3 years earlier. A paper bag was found. The police found Mary Hogan's face. Ed Gein had ripped off the woman's face and sewn it into a mask. The police also found an entire outfit made of the skin of other women. A belt had been made from 8 female nipples. Ed Gein was located. He was having dinner at a neighbor's house as if nothing had happened. He was arrested and handcuffed personally by our sheriff. In several of the photos released, at this moment, Ed Gein is laughing. At the police station, Ed Gein confessed to the murder of Bernice Wharton with coldness and rich detail. In that first statement, Art Sheriff couldn't hold back. He grabbed the maniac's head and forcefully slammed it against the wall several times. This statement was ignored by the justice system, but it made no difference. Ed Gein repeated everything again in several other statements over the years. He never hid and showed signs of remorse. Augusta Gein's son was a deeply disturbed mind. According to Gein, despite having clues raised by the police, most of the mutilated bodies found in his house had been taken from the cemetery. Ed Gein violated the graves of women who had just died. He was trying to prepare a woman's outfit so that he could become the only thing he loved in this world, his own mother.
Art Sheriff spent the following months answering calls and giving answers from other investigators, from other nearby missing persons cases that could be linked to Ed Gein. Unfortunately or sadly, only the deaths of Mary and Bernice were connected to Ed Gein. Nothing else was ever proven. Edward Theodore Gein, the Glenfield butcher, was deemed by a psychiatric board as unfit for trial. He received treatment for mental disorders and was deemed fit to stand trial only in 1968. 11 years after being captured, Ed Gein was convicted of the murder of Bernice Ward, but declared legally insane. Ed Gein was confined in psychiatric asylums until 1984, when he died at age 77 from lung cancer. Ed Gein's house was scheduled to be auctioned in March 1958, days before it caught fire mysteriously. The Glenfield Volunteer Fire Department took the longest possible route to get there. It was only 10 kilometers away, but when the teams arrived and the house had burned down to the foundations. Frank Ward, son of Bernice Ward, was now the captain of the fire department. The cause of the fire was never investigated. A simple Google search reveals hundreds of websites selling books, records, photos, subscriptions, films, and even t-shirts with the image of Ed Gein. His evil shadow returns to haunt us, to test our limits as a society, for us to question what went wrong with Ed Gein. Did Augusta really create a monster, or was it all already inside him? Why do we remain obsessed with scary figures, and why do we underestimate the true heroes? Have you ever wondered that? Well, I don't have any of those answers, I know, but Augusta got one thing right. Evil is part of being human. This is a real case that surpassed and influenced fiction. This is a story that doesn't have a happy ending for anyone. So thank you for this video. I now look forward to your comments below with new tips for this channel. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The most important thing is to know that you are arriving and staying for the next videos, especially also binge watching the other videos. So I'm really counting on your subscription, on your sharing of this work. Take it to social media, show it to your friends, share this video. So it's important for us to know that we are breaking the mold. And thank you very much for that, and until the next video, hugs.